7:52 here, Big 550 KTRS. There is a new book out, which is great for a snowstorm. Cuddle up with a good book. It's called Believer, and it's written by our next guest. He was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, and, well, you could make an argument that he is the reason why President Obama is sitting in the White House today. His new book is all about his rise as a political consultant. David Axelrod, the book is Believer. Welcome to KTRS here in St. Louis.
Thanks for having me.
Let's go back to 2004 because a lot of people forget that State Senator Barack Obama was going to run against Jack Ryan, which was going to be a pretty big and pretty contested Senate race. The newspaper releases some divorce proceedings, embarrasses Ryan. He has to step aside and gives your candidate basically a walk to that Senate seat, which then propels him to the White House.
Yes, well, let me say that we did think that we were going to face Jack Ryan, and that was a break. I will say we had a heck of a lot of momentum coming out of that primary, and that momentum was accelerated ultimately when the president gave the keynote speech, then Senator Obama, State Senator Obama, at the Democratic National Convention in 2004. But then you had the peculiar judgment on the part of the Republican Party in Illinois to they figured you had one really charismatic African-American candidate, and maybe they could counter him by importing their own Alan Keyes from Maryland. He turned out to be a disastrous candidate, so there's no doubt that was a stroke of luck. But I'm very confident that Obama would have won either way.
But at that point, they were talking about Mike Ditka running, and they were talking about anybody. It sounded
I
like
think your name came up.
well, you would have had an easier race all the way to the to the White House. Let's talk about Obamacare, because that is going to be the defining legacy of President Obama, and it seems like you passed legislations that Republicans, it was a Republican idea. Mitt Romney passed it in Massachusetts. It was a Heritage Foundation idea. You passed their legislation and drove him crazy doing it.
Well, yeah, and we really wanted it to be a bipartisan effort. We waited 6 months for the Senate Finance Committee to act on the hope that that committee would become a place where we could forge a bipartisan agreement around this, and we had folks who had been involved in drafting the bill, Republicans in the 90s that had many of the same elements, come in, talk to the president, agree on most of the elements, but they all said the same thing, which is, there's basically a strategy, a policy in our caucus not to cooperate, so you'd have to get a whole bunch of other Republicans because I don't want to stand there on my own, and we just never could crack that. And Senator McConnell's been very open about the fact that he enforced great discipline around that issue because he didn't want to give the bill a patina of bipartisanship, regardless of what its genesis was.
What happens now going forward with the Affordable Care Act when a Republican gets back into the Oval Office at some point? It's going to be so entrenched, even though they have ran against it, they're going to have to keep it, correct?
I think so. It's very hard to tell tens of millions of Americans that we're going to go back to the old days when pre-existing conditions kept you from getting insurance, when insurance companies could basically have their way, monthly, yearly caps, lifetime caps on the services you use. So if you get grievously ill, your insurance isn't worth anything anymore. There are so many things about this law that are going to be hard to reverse. And by the way, one thing it's done is contributed to reforms within the healthcare industry, so that we now see some control on this healthcare inflation that was going wild before the passage of this law. So I think it's going to be very hard to reverse, and it's going to go down in history as a great accomplishment. And the president deserves credit for it, because I and other political people were very leery about it. And McGraw, what he said when we raised our objections was, what are we supposed to do, put our approval rating on the shelf and admire it for 8 years, or are we supposed to draw down on it to try and do something of lasting value to the country. And you know, I really admired him for that. I always joke that I like him so much because he listened to me so little.
David Axelrod is our guest. The book is called Believer, My 40 Years in Politics. I think Democrats would be critical of you and your former boss because you didn't sell it well enough. Republicans put you in a box and called it death panels and everything else, and I think Democrats would argue that you guys did a terrible job of explaining it to the Americans.
Well, I'm pretty candid in the book about my own challenges in that period of time. There's a whole chapter on the healthcare fight, and it was I don't claim to be triumphant in that. And the problem was there's a reason why 7 presidents had tried to do it and 7 presidents had failed. It was a very, very touchy and difficult issue, in part because 85% of Americans had coverage. A lot of the focus was on how we would cover the 15% who didn't. And it obscured the fact that the law had so many features that were going to make people more secure who had insurance. I mentioned some of them before. Lifetime caps,
right,
gone. Pre-existing condition ban, gone. Insurance companies could not use more than 20% of their premiums for their own expenses and bonuses and so on, or else they'd have to rebate money. All of that stuff is embedded in this bill. It's like the Patient's Bill of Rights that we fought for in the 90s on steroids. But it was very hard to convey because the whole focus was on the uninsured, and people felt like this wasn't for them, it was for someone else. And we never were able to crack that code. And I'm frank about it in the book. It was a very exasperating experience to try and develop messaging around this. Plus, McGraw, you had hundreds and hundreds, it may be a billion by now, of negative ads from the opponents mischaracterizing the Affordable Care Act. That didn't help either.
David Axelrod, we have to leave it there. To finish the conversation, we'll just buy the book, Believer, My 40 Years in Politics. David Axelrod, good luck, and thanks for checking in.
Thanks for having me.
Quick check of